So we're going to devote the next hour to the discussion on Al-Andulus. Now, again, in order to really talk about the history of Muslims in Spain or Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, you have to contextualize the whole discourse again, just like I did with regard to Africa, so that we can understand what was going on at that time. As I said in the previous presentation, Islam began to expand into Egypt 40 years after the death of the Prophet. And of course, Muslims gradually exercised hegemony over North Africa. And with the establishment of Muslim naval presence in the Mediterranean, the Umayyad dynasty became the dominant force in the Mediterranean. Now, the Umayyad would lose power. There would be a coup against them by the Abbasid, just like the Shah of Iran was kicked out of power by a movement led, in retrospect, we say Khomeini, but there were other forces in Iran that led to that. The same thing happened. A man by the name of Abu Muslim became the ringleader or the chief propagandist of the Shiite forces that were opposed to the Umayyad. And gradually, of course, his movement, or the movement with which he was identified, became a very powerful subversive force. And in the end, they were able to overthrow the Umayyad dynasty. And of course, the Umayyad are known in Islamic history for reversing a precedent that the Prophet established. The Prophet did not call himself a king, because the Arabs had some people who were kings in Yemen and in the northern part of Arabia bordering Syria. You have the Himyarites and the Ghazanid Arabs. One was linked to the Persians, the other one was linked to the Romans. But basically, the Arabs had their sheikhs, who was primus inter pares, first among equals. Now, that was the tribal arrangement. As a result of the Umayyad taking over the Islamic movement, monarchy was introduced into Islam. So they established a line of kings. They carried the title Caliph, but they were no longer elected. It was now based on succession, something that went against the grain of early Islam, because none of the caliphs was succeeded by his kid. I mean, Abu Bakr was not succeeded by his son. Omar was not succeeded by his son. Usman was not succeeded by his son. It was through election among the Sahabas. Now, the Umayyad established a dynasty based on succession within the royal family, because they created a royal family, which was very un-Islamic. Now, this is the background for the Muslim coming to Spain, because the Muslims had already conquered North Africa, and the Umayyad were ruling this huge empire, the Umayyad family. Now, because they dominated the region, when their power fell, they lost out throughout the empire. Now, the Muslims had already conquered Spain during the Umayyad dynasty. But after the Umayyad were overthrown, they were ruthlessly killed as a family, because they were in a banquet when all of them were massacred. So, I mean, and there was a survivor in the family who would find his way into North Africa and then eventually come to Spain. And of course, he will be known in the history books as Abdurrahman, who will be Abdurrahman the First, who came in and resurrected the Umayyad dynasty. Now, he was able to establish what one will call today a government in exile, but a real government in exile. Of course, I'm sure he entertained dreams that eventually he would go and take over the dynasty from the Abbasid. this was not going to happen. So he found himself in Spain, which was, from the point of view of the medieval Arabs, very much far. It's like the New Englanders. I mean, like if you live in Boston or New York at the beginning of the Republic, when they tell you about Tennessee, that's far away, or or Georgia, that was really way off there. In the early American Republic, they live in Georgia or out there, you have to be in New York or in Boston really to be in the center of things. The same thing with the Arabs at that time. That were the far edges of the empire. It was nice to be in Damas or in Baghdad, or Khorasan, or some of those places which were the center, the heartland of the early civilization. Now, these Umayyads who survived in Spain, building on what they had done earlier, because it was the Umayyad navy that was able to maintain Umayyad hegemony in the Mediterranean. So when this Abdurrahman came into that region and created what was a government in exile for the Umayyad, who had lost power in the heartland of Islam, you now have a new beginning. And of course, the Muslims conquered Spain earlier with Tariq. And of course, Tariq, is now immortalized in the anglicized version of his name, Jabal al-Tariq, Gibraltar, as we call it today. Now, Tariq, of course, was able to conquer Spain for the Umayyads, likely because the people we now call Portuguese and Spanish people were being ruled by the Visigoths. You remember the Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Goths, and the Visigoths. They had conquered North Africa and Spain centuries earlier, and they were still ruling that region when the Arabs came to North Africa. And of course, the Arab armies succeeded in dislodging the Visigoths in Spain, just like they had done with the Byzantines in Egypt. Remember, you had the local people in Spain who were tired of these Germanic groups ruling them. And of course, when the Arabs came, they collaborated with the Arabs to conquer. And of course, the Arabs were able now to establish hegemony. Now, the majority of the people will still be Catholics. They were Christians. But gradually, the Muslims would begin to convert many of these Christians, to the point that you have, very much like in modern vocabulary today. Today, we have Westerners and we have Westernized people, right? The same thing, the Muzarabes. You have those Muzarabes. You have those Christians who were Arabized. They dress like Arabs. Many of them learn Arabic because that was the in thing to be. You see, it was nice to be an Arab in those days. Just like today, it's nice to be American. You go to many parts of Africa and Asia, they like to put a Jorda's jean and all that. That was what was happening at that time. This is what happened with civilization. When you are dominant, everybody likes to be like you. And that's why Ibn Khaldun says that when the conquered people, they always like to dress like the conquerors, they like to talk to the conquerors, and they see the source of their defeat in the civilization of the conqueror. You see what I'm saying? So they try to imitate their speech patterns, their dress, and their behavior. And this is true throughout human history. I mean, not only in the Mediterranean, but it's true in Europe, in America, in Africa, all over the world. This is a global pattern of behavior among human beings. The conquered always see the source of their defeat in the culture of the conqueror. And of course, in the case of the Iberian Peninsula, the Christians who were there began to imitate the Arabs. They dress like the Arabs, they speak Arabic, and gradually many of them became Arabized and Islamized. This is very important to know. Now, some of the Christians who were living to the north, who were not conquered by the Arabs, continue to resist Arab Muslim culture because the Muslim army was stopped in a remote outpost. What was not significant to the Muslims, but was very significant from the point of view of Christian history, because Charles Martel was able to stop the Muslim armies in what we now call France, because the Muslims went all the way up, but they were checked back. And of course, the Christians were able to maintain control over northern Spain throughout that period when Muslims ruled. 700 years is a long time. You see, and they were able to resist, and of course you have this back and forth fight. Now, the Muslims who were able to establish control over the Iberian Peninsula established themselves. You see, if you want to really understand what happened with the Muslims and the Christians in Spain, the closest analogy I can think of in my reading of history is China and the British Empire. The British were able to control Hong Kong, but they were never able to conquer the Chinese. You see, so Hong Kong, Singapore, all those became Chinese piece of land which were controlled by the British Empire. But the British were never able to conquer the Chinese. The moment the Chinese get strong, they'll kick the British out of these areas. And that's what happened with the Muslims. The Muslims were able to control southern Spain. They were able to control southern Spain, what we now call southern Spain, and establish their culture there. But they were not able to conquer the northern part of Spain, where the Christians continued to resist for a long time during that period of time. And of course, gradually the Christians will begin to capture these piece of real estate. Now, what is very interesting, and this is a very important point to bear in mind, is that when the Muslims conquered Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, they were able to rule much of that land they conquered as a single entity. But within a span of a century and a half, you witness fragmentation. And this would be the source of disunity and later the collapse of Muslim power in the Iberian Peninsula. Because so long as the Muslims were united and they controlled the single entity, they were able to resist the northern reconquest that was being attempted, even during the time of the Crusades. But you see, once the Arab rulers of these territories fragmented into small city-states, they became vulnerable. Because what happens then is you witness a new kind of diplomacy, very much like the diplomacy in Western Europe. Frenchmen fighting Germans, Germans fighting English, and you find different kind of alliances. The same thing happened with the Arabs. These different kingdoms that were created by the Arabs fighting each other. And some of them will align with some Christians against some Arabs, and then some Christians will align with Muslims against Arabs. So, I mean, you find it was not religion. They were personal interests, dynastic interests. They were fighting each other. Some Arab Muslims will align themselves with some Christians against some Muslims. Some Christians will ally some Muslims against some Christians. That was the game. That was what was happening. Now, of course, later on, when the ideology of the crusade developed, these dynastic and personal interests begin to be less and less. And now you begin to see polarization between Christians and Muslims. And of course, since these Muslim territories were now split into small kingdoms, it was just a matter of time that they would lose out to the determined effort of the northern Christians who were trying to recapture their land. And that is one thing that has to be understood. Otherwise, you don't understand why North Africa became Muslim and Arabic, and Spain, after 700 years, reverted to Christianity. Because the histories are different. In North Africa, the Arabs intermarry with the Berbers, just like they did in Spain. But the difference is, in North Africa, the whole piece of real estate was under Arab Muslim control. Whereas in Spain, there was still land left for the Christian Spaniards to maintain their culture and their tradition and to resist. something that did not happen to the Berbers in North Africa. That's a point which has to be emphasized when you make a comparison between North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The other point that needs to be borne in mind is that the Iberian Peninsula was linked to the rest of Europe, which was still Christian. The Berbers didn't have that. There was no other Berber land. All of Berber land was now Islamized and Arabized. That also becomes a very important point to take into account with regard to why after 700 years, it's like America. After 700 years, I don't think the Native Americans are going to come back here. I don't think so. So I don't think that's going to happen. So I mean, if you do comparative historical studies of civilization, because the local groups don't have any basis to come back, to wage an offensive, to take back their land. It didn't happen. But that happened in the Iberian Peninsula. In the Iberian Peninsula, the northern part of Spain was still Christian, and they were engaged in a reconquest. And of course, from the 11th century, we see gradually attempts at recapturing. One by one, many of these kingdoms fell into Christian hands, Seville, and as you go down the line, until you come to 1492, and the last stronghold, just like Hong Kong and the British, fell. And of course, they took back their land. So I mean, this is precisely what happened in Spain. If you really want to look at Spanish history from a world history point of view, and you look at comparative perspective. Now, it is against this background of give and take, conquest and reconquest, that you can understand what was happening. Now, we can develop a number of themes with regard to the Muslim presence in Spain. Because the Muslims were dominant at that time, the Andalusian region, because the name itself is taken from the Vandals, Vandalus in Arabic, Vandalus, Andalusia, the Vandals lived there. So, I mean, the Muslims began to transform the Iberian Peninsula culturally. You began to see that the palatial lifestyle of the Muslim rulers in Baghdad and in Damascus was now beginning to be imported into the area. And of course, the lifestyle in Cordoba, which is now celebrated by Muslim historians and many who write about the Muslim presence in Spain, you see that new cities and towns were created. And in Cordoba, from the 785 AD, Muslim rulers began to compete with one another in terms of building the best kind of towns and cities. They created a lifestyle which was very attractive to other Europeans, to the point that European rulers and noblemen used to come to Cordoba for medical checkup. Just like today, many third world rulers will come to Ohio Hospital, Cincinnati somewhere, or in Walter Reed Hospital to have medical checkups. So, I mean, you have that kind of situation where Cordoba became a very attractive center of culture and civilization. And of course, many of these people who were coming into Cordoba were being attracted because Cordoba was not only a center of learning, but it was also a major emporium in terms of buying and selling. You have goods coming from various parts of the Muslim world into Spain. When we were talking about Islamization in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, we talk about the golden trade of the Moors. Gold was now moving from Sub-Saharan Africa to Spain, and of course, slaves were being imported from the African continent and from Eastern Europe, and many of those slaves found themselves in the Iberian Peninsula. You also had spices coming from the east into the Iberian Peninsula. Many factories were established. Many people tend to forget that the word factory, which is now used in the English language, has an Italian origin, but the concept of a factory as understood in the medieval period was really part of the Islamic civilization. And the whole idea of banking came out of the Arab civilization. I mean, now many Arabs don't even know that the concept of a check It grew out of the Islamic civilization. And because the Islamic civilization was built on the notion of trust. You do not only trust God, but you trust your fellow man. So if I'm from Andalus in Cordoba and I'm going for Hajj, it takes months, because to travel from Andalusia in Spain to Egypt used to take you almost 3 months in those days. And then from Egypt going to Saudi Arabia, you may add another couple of weeks. So it would be a 1-year journey if you're really interested in going for Hajj in those days. If you're coming from Timbuktu to go for Hajj, it will take much longer. But you can be given a check, a note signed by one person, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, so that when you go to Makkah, there is Kamal Jumjum. And Kamal Jumjum, who doesn't know you from Adam, but he recognized the signature of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, he will give you 1,000 dinar. That's how the check idea came from. You see, that is, now the Americans have taken that Arab Islamic civilization contribution to the plastic, to the point that now you can go anywhere else with your MasterCard or Visa. And you can see the names given to it, Visa. You don't need a visa, you can go anywhere. Like from place to place. All you have, get your plastic. So jokingly, I always tell people when I give lectures in some universities or communities, that what is very strange, interesting really is that during the Islamic civilization, when this concept of the check became part of the human enterprise and the whole idea of a bank, because the whole idea of a bank is built on the Italian, who were very much influenced by the Muslim, gave the English and the Germanic and other languages the word bank. But banco is a translation of something that was done by the Muslims in Spain and in the East, in Baghdad. You have a bench and a scale. The word bank is banco in Italian, meaning a bench. So in the Islamic civilization, all you needed was you have a scale, you have just measure of balancing, and you lend money to people under mudaraba or musaraka kind of concept. Now, in Spain, of course, this process was taken to a higher level of sophistication and development. And of course, the Muslims were able to engage in this kind of transaction. But this was based on the concept of Tawheed and the whole concept of Muslim solidarity. I trust you, you trust me, and we all trust Allah. Now what has happened, of course, if you look at the concept of the check and the manner in which it has been transformed across civilization, because the Italians will get it, they pass it to the French, the Dutch, and then the British and all the other groups. Now it's in America. You can see the transformation of values, because what happens now, many of us with our credit cards, we go into a gas station, we feel very smugly secure. Fill it up. Now, the guy doesn't know you from Adam. They fill it up, and you flash your card. He doesn't trust you. He trusts MasterCard. You see what I'm saying? So the trust level has changed. I mean, when you carry the check from me, I trust you. And when you go to Stevens over there, he gives you the check, not because he knows you, but because he trusts me. You see, but now when I flash my MasterCard, the gas station attendant doesn't trust me at all, because he doesn't know me from Adam. You see what I'm saying? And the MasterCard people don't even know he exists. They know that he is working maybe at the gas station, but the MasterCard trusts me because they know everything about me. You see what I'm saying? So if you don't pay them, the state will go after you. You see the change in terms of consumption. Now, but this is what happened in terms of the Iberian civilization. That in the Iberian civilization, the Muslims were now in the West, because Spain is part of the Western world. And in the West, you witness the emergence and development of a civilization which was magnificent in terms of architecture. And of course, Muslims now talk about the Alhambra as a major structure, and that in Cordova you had these magnificent structures which were well furnished, based on the technology of the time, and of course, lighting the city or the town was something that was more elaborately done than in other ancient cities, because in Cordova alone, you had over 10,000 lamps. And you have a huge staff that was given the responsibility of putting the lights on. Of course, they didn't have power generator like we do today. With one generator, you can light a whole city, but they didn't have that. So you have individuals who will go and individually light each lamp. And of course, this was new. Today we take these things for granted, but that was a major innovation, because for many years human beings live in darkness after sunset. But in Cordova, as in Baghdad and in Damascus, this idea of keeping the lights on at night, which we take so much for granted today in America. American cities are the most lit cities anywhere in the world today. I mean, you just fly at night over Denver or Los Angeles, you will see this sea of lights at the bottom, below the, as you fly across over the airport set for landing. I mean, in Cordova, the Muslim societies were able to create a new civilization on the European continent, transplanting into Spain much of what was available in the East. Not only in terms of markets, factories, because they have tanneries, potteries, and all kinds of artisan groups that were in establishment. In the marketplace, you have people from various parts of the Muslim world converging, buying and selling. You have magicians, and you have all kinds of people in these kinds of cities. Now, they imported grain, wheat, olive oil, dry fruits, silk, iron, and all these other items that were needed to create such a civilization. You had weavers, cobblers, tanners, who were producing all the creature comforts that were needed in that kind of civilization. The Muslims introduced a new concept of architecture and the use of space. If you look at Islamic architecture, what is very striking about it is that wherever the Muslims were dominant, the use of space was very much influenced by the Tawhidic consciousness. And that is, they would always have Al-Masjid Al-Jami, that community mosque at the center of the city, so that people will be buying and selling around that masjid. But at the time of prayer, they will leave everything they were doing in the marketplace and they will stream into the mosque. If you look at most Muslim big towns and cities around the world, you will have this arrangement. You have a central mosque, and around the central mosque, you will have souks and and markets. People buying and selling around the mosque, but at the time of prayer, they will all stream into the mosque to pray. And they do this 5 times a day. Now, another thing that was very important was the public baths. Now today, we take it for granted. In the United States, American civilization today, people take showers. We take this thing for granted. But in the medieval period, people did not have showers. They did not take bath for months, some people. This may sound very strange today to Americans, but if you read the history books, you know that in the ancient world, people did not have showers or take baths frequently. Some of them may not take baths for months. You see, now, with the coming of Islam, this idea was introduced because the Muslims were supposed to wash 5 times a day. There's a famous saying attributed to the Prophet when one of the Bedouin asked him, why should we do ablution 5 times a day? And he said, if you have a stream in your backyard, a modern day American would say, if you have a swimming pool in your backyard, and you plunge into the pool 5 times a day, won't you be clean? The Bedouins say yes. Now, that concept was taken up and then translated architecturally by the Muslims to the point that in Baghdad, in Damas, and wherever they go, Khorasan, they always build public baths where people were supposed to bathe and wash themselves in preparation for prayer. So that was very much a part in the Iberian civilization. When the Muslims were in Spain, they created public baths. There were hundreds of them. If you read the literature, you will see that this was one thing that the Muslims were able to introduce in that part of the world. Now, the architectural layout did not only have the Masjid al-Jami surrounded by the souk and the marketplace, but the Muslims recognize that in the final analysis, much as you engage in this world, there is the hereafter waiting for you. So you will always have on the outer ring of the city the cemetery. So you are reminded on a daily basis by your architecture that you seek your portion of this world in the souk, but you cleanse yourself and purify yourself in the mosque in anticipation of your transportation to the cemetery. So you have these 3 sites, the mosque, the souk, and the cemetery. And you are constantly reminded that you are here for a short while, but you are going to end up in the grave. And this was the way. Now, what has happened is that the Muslims have lost that sense of consciousness to the point that really, if you look at the way they construct their mosque, I mean, because some of these mosques, you go to Cairo, you can see it more clearly. You really see conceptual confusion. So, I mean, like some of these mosques used to have minarets, but you may see some other building towering over the mosque, and there may be a minaret, but they may even move the minaret this way. There's a very good video done by Ismail Siraj, who is at the World Bank. He was one of the vice president for cultural affairs, and looking at culture and development. And he did a beautiful job of showing the shifting of a paradigm of a culture. Of course, he's Egyptian, but he shows it very clearly how the paradigm shift in many of these Muslim countries is reflected architecturally. Because in the Iberian Peninsula, the Muslims were able to replicate in the Iberian world the paradigm that they had in the East. And of course, this was evident in terms of their markets, their mosques, their cemeteries, and the manner in which they created their public baths, and they reinforced each other in that light. Now, one other thing that needs to be understood is the fact that they created their mills, their tanneries in the outskirts of the city, so that the mills where they ground wheat, barley, and all that was out of the city, and then they were carted into the marketplace for sale to the people. Now, the Muslims were also very conscious of how to mint their coins, in the sense that they use silver to produce the dirham, and they use gold to mint the dinar. These were the 2 denominations that were used in terms of exchange. And of course, this contributed to the development. And then of course, like in the East, in the Muslim Spain, this whole idea of the muhtasib. Remember I told you in the history of Islam in the United States that one of the nicknames given to Teddy Roosevelt was that he was Harun Rashid Roosevelt. Now, in Islamic civilizations, you always have market inspectors who will be seeing that the scales are just, they are not rigged, so that the merchant will fleece you in selling you oranges, onions, or whatever. So the muhtasib, like the inspectors who will go around inspecting the stalls in the marketplace, this became an institution in Islamic civilization, in Syria, in Iraq, and in other parts of the Muslim world. So this was also introduced in Spain. And of course, the Spaniards were very much affected by this. Now, the idea of the gates to the city were also very important. In Cordova, you had 7 gates to the city. And of course, just like in Mecca, you have the different gates into the Kaaba, you have gates into the city of Cordova. And of course, like in ancient Rome and Greece, these were very well fortified to protect the city from alien intrusion. You have this in the ancient world, long before Islam, long before Christianity, that civilizations tried to create gates, many access points into the city, and then, of course, they try to protect the city from foreign intrusion. Of course, the people who have gone the most to the most extreme in terms of protecting themselves are the Chinese in terms of the Great Wall, to really enclose themselves from the barbarians. But you have this in Cordova, that you have these 7 gates which were constructed by the Muslims to make sure that their civilization was not assaulted from outside. Now, besides this use of space Islamically, the Muslims, of course, inherited the legacy of the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, and the Christians, and all the other Mediterranean civilization, including the Chinese and the Indian civilization, because that's what civilization is all about. Once you become dominant, you immediately inherit the legacies of all those who came before you, just like modern-day Americans. Modern-day Americans are the beneficiaries of the British, the Dutch, the French, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, and all the other non-European contributors to human civilization. And you can see this very clearly in American society. I mean, people who are very educated and landed will know this. The average John and Jane Doe may not see it, but like those who are scholars, who are very educated, they know this is what has happened. You have a cumulative effect here. Same thing happened in Cordova and all the other city-states that were governed by the Muslims. The Muslims inherited the heritage of the other civilizations, but they had their own paradigm. And with their paradigm, they were able to interpret this inherited tradition from other human societies. And this was very clear in terms of the Muslim libraries. Cordova had more libraries than any other city in the world at that time. And of course, you had international students who came from Europe. We know some of them, Roger Bacon, Gregory of Cremona, and many others who came from Europe as foreign students, just like you have in American universities and colleges, many international students. What is very interesting, there's a very good book written by Ada Bosseman. If you read that book on international cultural history, she describes some very interesting situation about European foreign students who were coming to study in Spain. They had a hard time compared to international students today, because in those days, Latin was the common dialect. So if you came from Germany or Britain to study at the feet of Muslim scholars, in Spain, you would have to get a Spanish Christian who knew Latin and also speak Spanish. And then you'll have to get a Jewish teacher who will translate from Arabic into Spanish. And then from Spanish, the Christian will translate into Latin. That's how Europeans were studying in Spain. They had to get Jews, Christians, and Muslim teachers to help them learn at the same time. That's how the knowledge was passed. And over time, many of these European students who came to study in Spain acquired the knowledge, just like African students coming to America, learning about Plato and Aristotle at the feet of their teachers. The same situation. We tend to forget this. After several centuries, of course, the pendulum will shift, because people are humans. They acquire the knowledge. Over time, they become independent. And that's precisely what happened. The European students who were coming in at great pain to themselves were gradually acquiring the knowledge from the Arabs. And as they acquired the knowledge, they became self-sufficient. And of course, the University of Padua in Italy, the University of Oxford, and the University of Paris, all these European universities now gradually develop just like we witness today in the modern world. I mean, like the Europeans who were the custodians of intellectual knowledge since the 16th, 17th century trained many Chinese. They went back to China, they went back to Africa, they went to India, and universities crop up in those societies. This is precisely what was happening. Many of those European students who came to study in Spain, where the Arabs were dominant, gradually absorbed knowledge. What you have to recognize here, and that's why Spain became the bridge between the East and the West. And what was known as Greek knowledge, unknown to Europeans, was passed through the Arabs. Because what happened then is, but just like this happening today, many of the Arabs and Muslims who are oblivious of their classical knowledge, which is now being preserved in American universities. They come and study Islam in America. You're an Arab from Arabia. Why are you coming to study Islam in America today? This was the same thing. The Europeans were coming to study about the Greeks from the Arabs. Just like Arab students now get PhDs from Harvard in Islamic studies. Can you imagine that? You're from Egypt. They speak Arabic. You're from Iraq. You have to come to New York to be taught about your past. This was what happened to the Europeans. They had to come to learn about the Greeks from the Muslims, because the Muslims were the custodian of Greek knowledge. And you have to know the history, why this was the case. Because the eastern wing of the Roman Empire, we call the Byzantines, when the Vandals and the Visigoths overrun the western part of the Roman Empire with Attila the Hun, the center of culture moved to the east. And it was the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire which were the custodian of the knowledge about the ancient Greeks. And since they became rival to the Catholics, the knowledge was with them. And they were now living under Muslim hegemony. So when the Muslims were ruling Spain, that knowledge was transferred to them in Spain. So if you're a Western Christian and you want to know about Plato and Aristotle and others, you have to go to the Arabs. And that's what happened. So this way, that knowledge gradually went back. That's why you have, if you read St. Aquinas, who is the leading thinker of Christendom, next to Augustine, Summa Theologica, which is his major work, you will see over 100 citations to Ibn Rus. You see, and many of those early Christian thinkers, just like many Arabs and Muslim thinkers today, they will quote Bernard Lewis and all these other people when they write. You see what I'm saying? This human knowledge, that's how knowledge transfers from one group to the other. And as a result, Spain became the center of knowledge at that time. And you find a rich collection of books in their libraries. And the Spanish Muslims became very influential, not only in the West, but also in the East. People like Ibn Rus, people like Ibn al-Arabi, and people like Ibn Hazm, and countless others who influenced the way British royalty later on would be looking at horses and how you use horses. You know, this whole idea of horse riding and the whole culture of horses, the Arabian horse, as they call it in the West. All that falconeering, use of the falcon in hunting. So many other things that were taking place grew out of Spain to the rest of Europe. And of course, they came to Spain from the East. That's what happened in terms of civilization. Now, the other thing that needs to be borne in mind with regard to what was going on at this particular time in history is the fact that the Spanish Muslims were very liberal, given the culture of the time, the temper of the time. Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, and Muslim scholars, before the creation of Israel and before the Cold War, if you go back, you look at those books, you will see that they saw Spain as the halcyon days of interfaith coexistence. Because at that time in Spain, the Christian, the Jew, and the Muslims lived together. In retrospect, this was an ideal time in the literature when these religious communities coexisted. Of course, they were not, and here you speak from the point of view of someone living in the United States in the 1990s. Spain was certainly, Muslim Spain, in my view, was certainly not America of the 1990s, where you have separation of church and state, and theoretically, no single religion enjoys hegemony over the others, even though numerically, in the American context, you have more Christian than Jews or Muslim or Buddhists or Baha'i or Hindus. You see what I'm saying? But in Muslim Spain, what you did have was a civilization where the Muslims enjoy hegemony, politically speaking, but culturally and socially, the groups that saw themselves as minorities were able to move freely in that culture within the limits determined by their civilization and their culture. And I think that becomes very important when we look at Muslim Spain, vis-a-vis, say, American society of the 1990s. But like all civilizations, they go through stages. There is no one period in the history of Andalusia which was replicated across time and space throughout. That doesn't happen. All civilizations go through changes. You may have good times and bad times. The civilization goes up and then down, or up again. And this is something that what we have to take into account, because there were instances where you had fights between these factions. Earlier on, I pointed out to you that there were dynastic and personal interests among the kings. When some of these Muslim kings in these petty kingdoms would align with some Christians against another Muslim, and vice versa. You had those developments in the history of Spain. But when you look at really the material base of the Andalusian civilization, you will say that in the Andalusian civilization, these Spanish Muslims were able to create a society where the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims together live in a social and cultural system where individuals were able to rise to higher points on the political ladder than they were elsewhere in the Muslim world. And that's one reason why Andalusian Spain, Muslim Andalusia is widely celebrated now when we look retrospectively. Now, let me just make 4 more points with regard to the developments that were taking place in Andalusian Spain. And that is, when the Umayyad dynasty conquered Spain, they developed naval hegemony in the Mediterranean until they were wiped out when the Umayyad lost the heartland of the Muslim world, and an Umayyad government in exile was created in what was then considered the frontier, Spain, in 758. But then later on, what was a frontier would become very developed. This is a pattern of all civilizations. An analogy that one can give to Americans is when the founding fathers created the 13 colonies, what is now called California was a hinterland, a wilderness. But today, just 200 years or less than 150 years, California now is a very important cultural part of the United States. The same thing happened in Andalusia. Andalusia was a backwater area, but then Andalusia became a major center of civilization to the point that it rivaled Baghdad, and you have poets from Andalusia who wrote glowingly about their city. Why talk about the cities of Baghdad and others? We have it here. You see what I'm saying? So just like Californians, you see what I'm saying? Now they have Hollywood and all kinds of things. The same thing. I mean, that is what one has to take into account when you look at civilizations. How what was a backyard or backwater area becomes very much part of the mainstream and begin to have a lot of influence. And that is something we have to take into account when we look at Andalusian Spain, that here was a refuge for the surviving remnants of the Umayyad, gradually becoming a major center of Islamic civilization. That's one point I want to leave you with. Second point I want to leave you with when we talk about Muslim Andalusia is the fact that in Andalusia, the Muslims were now able to create a showcase in the southern tip of Europe, a showcase which would impress many of the Europeans to the point that, as I said earlier, European kings and nobilities used to come to Andalusian Spain for medical treatment because they were very advanced in the use of herbs, in surgery, and in pharmacopoeia. And of course, they contributed a great deal to European knowledge of science. For many years, the Qanun of Ibn Sina was the textbooks in medical schools in Europe for over 300 years. And this was likely because of the influence that came out of this civilization. So the transaction flow between the Islamic world and the West was largely mediated through Andalusia. And of course, the poetry and the literary tradition of the West was very much influenced by some of the writings of these people from that part of the world. If you read some of the scholars like Gilson and others who have written about the Arab-Muslim influence in Western intellectual thought, you will see ample evidence to show this. You read Ada Bosman and others, they'll give you a lot of evidence to prove this in terms of the transaction flow and the influence from the Muslim world by way of Spain to the rest of Europe. And of course, the legacy of this civilization to the West is most evident in many of the words that are now part of the vocabulary in English, in Spanish, in Italian, and all the others. Now, of course, as a backlash, the Spaniards would like to wipe out, just like the Chinese today, if they get hold of Hong Kong and Singapore, they would like to Sinanize these parts of the world after they have been anglicized for several centuries. The same thing happened in Spain, to the point that many of the Muslims and the Jews were kicked out after Granada fell. Once Ferdinand and Isabel came to power, there was a purge, and the Inquisition led to the exodus of many of these people. Many of them, of course, went underground. In the case of the Muslims, they play taqiyya, known to the Shiites. You know, you don't reveal your true identity. And of course, the Jews, the Moranos, they call them in the literature, also play taqiyya in terms of hiding their names and their identity, to the point that they change their names. You find many of the Muslims who would change their names, and you find remnants of that. The Jews who found themselves in this kind of situation, your name is Levi, so you will hide your name and you call yourself Ben Levides. So, I mean, you have Spanish who still have that name, Ben Levides. And, you know, and if you go to, I mean, and you have some of those Muslims, Arabs, who will change their names. They may call themselves Ben Medina. You see, like to keep Medina as a code name to show their Muslim names, or Gonzalez. I mean, you know, like, you have this. Some of the scholars who are investigating this phenomena are now beginning to realize that this kind of passing, you know, was taking place, changing your name so that you cannot be detected as member of the targeted group. And this happens in the history of Spain. This happened with civilizations when groups move into each other's territory. You have the convergence or divergence of civilization. The third point I want to leave you with regard to the Muslim presence in Andalusia is the fact that when we look at the Muslim presence in Andalusia, we have to recognize the fact that in Andalusia, the Muslims did not only build libraries where they store the collective wisdom and knowledge of humankind available to them, because they learned a lot from the Chinese. The Prophet told them, go to China to learn knowledge. They got learned a lot from the Indians, because the Indians contributed to what we now call the Arabic numerals. The 0 came from India. And of course, that was also passed on to Europe, because you cannot do long division with Latin numbers. So, that became very important in terms of the development of mathematics. Now, the fourth point that needs to be emphasized here really is the fact that if you look at the transaction flow from Andalusia to the west, you will see that the writings of Ibn Rus, Ibn Khazim, Ibn Sina, and many others impacted in the understanding of Aristotle and Plato, in the understanding of medicine, in the understanding of chemistry, alchemy, and in the understanding of geometry, to the point that in the English language we have words like chemistry coming from the Muslim world by way of Spain. We have words like logarithm from al-Khawarizmi, you see, and many other words that one can identify in the English language. And of course, scholars have documented all this. All we have to do is go to the library, read these things, and they become part of our mental furniture. Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I have a year on the time when the caliph became elected and not successive? When was this?
Yeah, this was from 632 to 656.
Okay, and I'm showing my ignorance here, but give me a year, please, on Charles Martel stopping the spread of Islam.
Well, the Charles Martel, stopped Islam, I think it's in, 781, I think, 781. Is it? 56, around that time. Because, it's about 6 years after the collapse of the Umayyad. 6 years after the collapse of the Umayyad. The Umayyad collapsed in 750. So 756, yeah.
Okay.
So you know that poem about Charles?
Roland. The Song of Roland.
Yeah, but it's in here.
The Song of Roland. The French still sing that. Because, this is how they stop the Arabs. The Song of Roland. It clicks now.
Yeah, it clicks now.
The Song of Roland. That was the celebration of Charles Martel. But really, you see, we have to put this thing in proper context. You see, from an American civilization point of view, to the Vietnamese, you see, the Tet Offensive is very important to them. But to Americans, really, in retrospect, in terms of American civilization, the Tet Offensive really is not significant. It was significant for Americans who opposed the war and those who are prosecuting war. But in the larger perspective of history of American civilization, when Americans have the potential of going to outer space and having more land in outer space, that's nothing. That's what happened to the Muslims, if you want to understand the Muslim consciousness. But that was a major turning point, though, from the point of view of the Christians in the Iberian Peninsula. Because these are these colonizers and imperialists, we're kicking them out. Just like the Vietnamese have a different understanding of Dien Bien Phu from the Western people. You see what I'm saying? You have to understand these things from the point of view of both sides. You see, for Charles Martel, that was a major development. And of course, in Western history, that will be widely celebrated. But it was even an unknown event in the heartland of Islam at that time. Yes, please.
You've spoken eloquently about the collaboration between Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars. Could you comment just, well, I know it's a whole book, but what Christians did when they actually entered Muslim cities, especially in terms of like the burning of the library and, or was it?
Yeah, well, you see, this is the point. You see, once the reconquistadors retook the Muslim occupied Spain, from their point of view, you have to understand that they see it, after 700 years, we are back. That's how they saw it. So when they came in, this coincided with some developments within the Catholic Church, the Inquisition. You see, and the target of the Inquisition included three people: Muslims, Jews, and irreconcilable Christians. Because there were some Christians who were targeted because they were seen either as collaborators or they were not towing the line. You see, so this became very important because when they came in, they began to eliminate these groups. Many of them fled. I mean, the Muslims fled to North Africa. They became exiled in North Africa. Many of the Jews fled and went to North Africa. And of course, some of them went to Turkey. That's why Turks have very good relationship with Jews historically, because many of them went to Salonika. Many Jews fled to Salonika. Some of them went to Eastern Europe. Some of them went to Holland. You see, now that is the history. So the burning of Muslim books, because they were seen as infidels. And of course, we lost a lot of information this way. Just like the Vandals and the Visigoths, they burned, we have the word vandal now in English, vandalizing. I mean, they came in, they were ignorant, they just burned everything. Now, these people were not ignorant, they were just religiously obsessed with the other side. It's that they felt that their books should not be in the hands of believers because they will be contaminated. And of course, many of these Muslim works, well, this happened in the Muslim world. Some of the Muslims didn't like any of their children to go to Western schools because they will be contaminated. The same kind of psychology existed. So the Inquisition and the anti-Muslim sentiment was so strong among these Christian Spaniards that they were destroying anything that was Muslim. And of course, those Muslims who did not reconcile by converting, and they introduced a new concept among the Spaniards, the whole concept of blood. Any Spaniards who had any drop of Arab blood was no good. The concept of Hidalgo, you see, Hidalgo, you know, you are someone who has pure blood. You are not contaminated by Arab or Jewish blood. So this way, you are a true Christian. So they link your Christian identity with your blood ties. And of course, this was a very dangerous concept because what you're saying is those people who are of Semitic origins should be bracketed because they don't believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. They are renegades, and their blood contaminate your bloodstream. And of course, this was very important for the Spaniards. And of course, they made sure that those people who were identified with the occupying forces and their collaborators. This, you see, modern Americans cannot see this because, you see, things have changed so radically in the world that this way of thinking and this understanding simply doesn't make sense to them. But that was the way. That's the way they were thinking at that time. Yes, please.
I think one of the big challenges for teachers talking about the world of Islam to Americans is not to make it seem so strange and exotic and different. And I noticed you've made a lot of parallels between Islamic civilization and American civilization. Is there an American civilization world? Do you believe that there's an American civilization on a world scale? Do we live in a time of the hegemony of the American world civilization?
Well, I mean, yeah, you have American scholars, people like Kamanga's, what's his name again? He wrote the American Century, Steele, Kamanga Steele, I think that's his name. He's American historian. Kamanga Steele. I mean, they wrote about the American, thank you very much. I mean, they talk about the American century. There is an American civilization if you define civilization as a human enterprise which brings about a federation or confederation of cultures and people under one political roof. You see, then there is an American civilization because you have a core which originally was Anglo-Saxon, and people have been assimilated to speak the dominant language, English. And there is a religious core because all civilizations have a religious foundation. And in the American context, it has been described as the Judeo-Christian foundation of American civilization. Of course, because of the separation of church and state, that base is potentially expandable to embrace other religious groups. You see what I'm saying? And it's happening in American society. The problem for Americans, both the intellectuals and the leaders, is that they have yet to accept the fact that they are now becoming a distinct civilization from Europe. Because you see, many Americans don't want that because they don't want to see themselves as different from Europe, even though the cultural base is shifting and changing. This is what happened with civilization. All civilizations went through that. The Greeks started with their city-state. That's why you have what? Hellas. You have the original Greek city-states, and then you have Hellenization. Those people who are not Greeks, but they were exposed to Greek culture. The same thing happened with the Roman civilization. It started with Rome, but then other groups like Jews, Arabs, and Circassian, and all those people we call Albanians today, and all those different groups in the Mediterranean became Romanized. Egyptians, they begin to have Roman names. If you look at the founding fathers of Christianity in Egypt, they were Egyptians, but they had Roman names. Aristasius, Arius. You see what I'm saying? So they became Romanized. The same thing is happening with American civilization. American civilization started with the 13 colonies, but then it expanded to embrace the whole continent and even cross the Pacific to embrace the Hawaiians. You see what I'm saying? And you have Spaniards like Puerto Ricans who are all part. And then you have the Virgin Islands where you have many people of African descent in addition to people of African descent in America. And then you have all these people from Asia who are now part of American civilization. What is happening is American intellectuals and American political leaders have yet to see to themselves, we are now moving away from the being extension of Europe, just like Australia or New Zealand is, extension of Europe, and now we are becoming our own. Now this process is more advanced in Australia because there are some Australian leaders who would like to move that way and say, we are now separate and distinct from England. But then you see, there are some who don't want that. When Keating, for example, in Australia, they call him the Lizard of Oz. Because, because he was trying to say that we are different from the English. You see, we have our separate identity. So you see, you have this phenomena. But see, this is what happened with civilizations. The original people, especially those who moved to the diaspora, and Americans are diaspora Europeans. They move out of Europe. Not all Americans, there are many others who are native people here, who are of Asian or African descent, who are here. But you see, the dominant group still see itself as an extension of Europe. And they're not willing to cut that umbilical tie, which happens with civilizations. It always happens with civilization. You start out from one point, and then you expand. And then you become stronger than the home base. And this is where American civilization, there is an American civilization. It is evident in American dress, it's evident in American speech, very early in terms of American breaking away from the English accent and English vocabulary. spelling labor in L-A-B-O-R as opposed to L-A-B-O-U-R, color and all that. These American lexicographers recognized the Americanization of the English language very early in the history of the Republic, in terms of the early lexicographers who developed American dictionaries. They were aware of this very early. And of course, you look at the kind of dictionaries, Webster and all the dictionaries that came out of America, showing that there is a distinct American English from English. And you find this in Australia, you find this in New Zealand, and South Africa. This is the thing. There is, I would argue, that there is a definite American civilization, but the intellectuals and the politicians have yet to come to terms with that reality. It will take time. I think another century or so, it will become very evident, and they will acknowledge that we now have a distinct civilization called American, even though it originally started out as an Anglo-Saxon culture. Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Could we go back to the concept of hidalgo and land
Yes.
in Spain? Really interesting, because you were talking earlier about the ecumenical nature of the community. Could we say that this is the sort of beginning of racism as we know it?
Yes, it is. I mean, many scholars have said that. I mean, some scholars have said that this whole idea of blood purity, which was designed to screen out the Muslim or Hispanics of Muslim or Jewish ancestry, certainly smacks of racism, because what you're now doing is you're conflating territorial identity, religious identity, and biological identity. That you are Spanish because of the land, you are Spanish because of your religion. If you are not Catholic, you cannot be Spanish. But you have groups who still insist that your identity is somehow compromised because you don't accept the religion. That's what you have right now in the Balkans. The Serbs is racism. The Serbs, the Croats, and the Serbs and the Bosnians speak the same language. They have the same language. Just like, that's why I tell Indians, people from India and Pakistan, that they have the closest parallel for outsiders from the Balkans to understand the situation in the Balkans, just to reinforce what you say. Because now if you go to India, you have Punjabis who are Hindus, Punjabis who are Muslims, Punjabis who are Sikhs. Isn't that true? They have a common language, Punjabi. Just like in the Bosnia, Serbia, Croat, the same language. But the languages have been colored by the religions. The Bosnians use Arabic once upon a time, which is Turkish version of the Arabic script before Ataturk, to write their history and their culture. The Croats have been influenced by the Roman Catholic Church. They use the Roman alphabet. And the Serbs have been influenced by the Greek Orthodox. They use the Cyrillic. So we speak the same language, but when it is written, we cannot read it. You see what I'm saying? So that is this reality that happened. But that's the root cause of racism, because what happens really is, I will say to you, you are not part of me because your language, you don't speak our language, or you don't write it the way I write it. You have been contaminated by the external group, the enemy. So yes, please, go ahead.
Two things. One, the Bogomil theory was actually brought about as a way of denying the fact that the Muslims had been Serbs before.
That is right.
So they created the Bogomil theory of conversion, which was completely fabricated. And then the other thing, more proof, is that one of the ways that they would identify was circumcision. They would see if they were circumcised or not. So it's a clear indication they couldn't even tell the difference between the people by their language or by their physical features. So they would have to check if they were circumcised to see if they were Muslim or not.
Yes. No, I mean, that's racism. That's the root cause of racism. It started that way. The whole Hidalgo concept.
Right. So am I right in understanding then that prior to this, this was not the case, because the spread of Islam, there was intermarriage and all that sort of stuff?
Yes.
So this was a totally new concept.
It was linked to the Inquisition, because you see, you introduced the whole concept of religious purity. And anyone who does not measure up to the interpretation of dogma was suspect. And of course, the most obvious suspects are those who don't believe in the first place. In this case, the Muslims and the Jews. The Muslims were suspected because they were the colonizers, from their point of view, and imperialists. The Jews because they don't believe in Christ, and they were collaborators with the Muslims. I mean, this may sound very strange to Americans today, but that's the way it was perceived at that time. You know, history is very funny, but that's what history is about. It's very strange. I mean, you have role reversals. Any other question? Otherwise, you know. Oh, okay. Thank you very much.